Good morning and welcome, speakers and audience, to this, the first webinar in the All Energy Decarbonise Virtual Summit, and the 19th we've held since May. There are over 560 people gathered in our virtual audience for the green recovery. I think you'll agree it's a highly relevant topic for each and every one of us and the organisations we represent. What a great panel we've gathered here this morning, each to address a particular aspect of the challenge ahead of us. I'd like to thank Scottish Power and the Scottish Government for sponsoring what I know will be a compelling 90 minutes. I'm Judith Patton, Project Director of our duo of shows and the co-creator of All Energy way back at the start of the century. It's time for some housekeeping points. Whilst I talk briefly, my slide will help you get the greatest benefit possible during your time with us today and afterwards. It's important that if you would like to ask questions or rate this webinar, you shrink your screen, full screen, to be able to see where to do both things. And if you opt for attachments, you can see all 8 of the webinars being held during this virtual summit. All will be available on demand not long after transmission if you can't be with us at broadcast time. All our panelists this morning are very special, and I'm very grateful to them for giving of their time. I'd like to particularly thank our chair, Keith Anderson, CEO of Scottish Power, for his support for All Energy. Not just financially, but we're mighty grateful, Keith, but for his generosity of spirit and in terms of time. He's recorded 2 compelling short videos, one on each of the webinars he's chairing this week. And he's one of those marvellous men on whom you know you can rely for stupendously sound advice. No wonder he has full responsibility for his company's activities in the UK, including the £5.3 billion investment plan to 2022 that's designed to strengthen the position of the company as the utility of the future. Without more ado, I'd like to wish all of you here today and your families good health in these strange times, and then pass over to Keith and his stellar cast of speakers for what I know will be a thought-provoking 90 minutes. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody joining us. It's great to be here. It's a real pleasure to be doing and chairing this opening session. At Scottish Power, for those of you who don't know us, we've been on a journey to get to a point where we're generating all of our electricity from 100% renewable sources, and we achieved that. And we're intending just to carry on down that route now for the remainder of time. We think it's the right place to be and the right thing to do. And we're at the forefront of doing that and trying to lead our industry down that path. It's at the core of everything we do now as an organisation. It's fundamental to us, but it's also our belief that it's fundamental towards the green economic recovery that everybody is talking about, and it's the subject of today's discussion. There seems to be a real consensus building now right across the industry, society, that the green recovery is essential, both for the economy, but also for tackling climate change. So it is a really, really good topical area for this discussion. We're going to spend the next hour and a half hearing from a brilliant panel of speakers, talking about what that green recovery means to them and how they see it taking place. On the panel today, we've got Tracy Black, who's the Director of CBI Scotland, Professor Sir Jim McDonald, who's the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Strathclyde, Angus McCrone, who's the Chief Editor of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and then Councillor Susan Aitken, the Leader of Glasgow City Council, which is where for the last number of years we've obviously been used to meeting as part of All Energy. And I'm sure we'll be back here soon and doing that in person soon as well. As Judith said, I believe there's about 500 of you sitting there at home. I hope you're not in bed in your pyjamas. So it's an image for Tracy, Jim, Angus and Susan to think about as they present. I hope you're all looking as brilliant, beautiful, handsome, wonderful, engaged as all of your panelists are this morning. I hope this is a good engaging session, a little bit of fun as well, hopefully as well. to make it interesting for everybody who's joined. But before we kick off with each of the panellists and the speeches, to get the session underway today, it's a real pleasure to introduce the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, who's going to say a few words right now. Thank you.
In a year's time, the eyes of the world will be on Glasgow. This time next year, we'll be 3 days into COP26, one of the most important global gatherings of the century so far. If it weren't for COVID, of course, we would currently be days away from COP26. For Scotland, as for other countries, responding to the pandemic will continue to be an overwhelming focus for some time to come. However, as we deal with the threat of COVID, we must never forget that the climate emergency is the greatest long-term challenge facing our world. Scotland is determined to play our part in meeting that challenge. We want to ensure that as we recover from the pandemic, we build back in a fairer and greener way. Our country has already set world-leading targets to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030 and to achieve net zero by 2045. And last year we outlined plans for a Green New Deal to help ensure a just transition as we move towards net zero. This year we enhanced that plan to support a sustainable economic recovery from COVID. We're investing almost £1.6 billion in the decarbonisation of heat over the course of this Parliament. We're creating a Green Jobs Fund to promote investment and to support employment in low carbon sectors. We're also helping established industries as they adapt to a low carbon and then a net zero future. Our Energy Transition Fund is helping oil and gas businesses to diversify, and we're assisting our industrial and manufacturing sectors. All of that is in addition to supporting new technologies such as carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. And finally, the new Scottish National Investment Bank will be open for business by the end of this year. Its primary mission is to drive the move to a net zero economy. The next 12 months will therefore see significant progress, even as we continue to tackle COVID and recover from its consequences. That's hugely important. When COP takes place in Glasgow next November, I want people to recognise Scotland as a country which, having pioneered the industrial age, is now showing the leadership needed for a net zero world. In doing so, we're facing up to the many challenges that presents. For example, the hard, ongoing work of decarbonising heat and transport. But we're also seizing the opportunities it creates to create new jobs, develop new technologies, and build a greener and fairer country. None of this, of course, can be done by government on its own. It needs to be a collective endeavour where government, business, the third sector and many others work together to achieve our shared ambitions. I'm already hugely grateful for the incredible work of our low carbon and renewable sector. You're the reason Scotland already has an international reputation in this field. And so the Scottish Government is determined to continue supporting you in the future. We recognise that you're vital to Scotland's long-term success. So let me thank all of you for the contribution you are making. I hope you find this event useful and informative, and I very much look forward to working with all of you as we build a stronger, fairer, greener Scotland in the months and years to come.
All right, that was great to see and hear from the First Minister and hear her speak so passionately about the importance of a green recovery. Hear her talk about how we move forward and use that to help us move forward beyond the impacts of the COVID pandemic and building back a better country and a better society. And I think those are incredibly important messages and ones that everybody would share. I think the other really important thing in there was just that message about we need to work together in doing this, that this isn't something that either governments, companies, society or stakeholders can do on their own. We all need to come together and have a joint strategy and a joint plan. I think that's a really, really important and critical message. So I've just got a few words I'm going to say before I then hand over to each of the speakers as well, and then we'll move to a Q&A. I think, from my perspective, as an energy company, as a utility, I would say, we've got an incredibly positive and pivotal role to play in the response to COVID and about kickstarting a green recovery and speeding up the progress towards net zero. The great thing from my perspective at Scottish Power, we have never intended to be, and we are not a bystander. We're not a spectator in this debate. We're actually a fully engaged company driving the agenda forward, driving the debate forward, and taking practical implementation steps as well. We've been investing massively in infrastructure, whether that's renewables generation, storage, networks. We think we need all of that to get the UK to net zero. We are the first port of call for all of the measures that we need to take in people's homes to get the communities greener and where we live greener, and that's either through energy efficiency, through smart metering, through EVs, or through the heating system and the installation of heat pumps, and we see that as being critical to the future. We're also trying to take all of the knowledge and expertise and experience we've built up from decarbonising the power sector to take it through other sectors like transport, heat, and industry as well, with constant innovation. And I think you see that now starting to come through all of the conversations about creating a hydrogen economy and how we start to look at decarbonising industrial processes and just how much that's taken off over the last few months. The past 8 months have clearly turned everything on their head. An awful lot of the stuff we used to take for granted or we understood as normal practice has changed and the landscape shifted. But like lots, we've adapted, we've got used to it, and we've tried to do that as a company. It's a mix of pragmatism, imagination, resilience, and just getting on with things. From our point of view, from the very, very first days of this crisis, we worked hard primarily to keep the lights on and look after our customers. Reinforcing energy supplies for critical infrastructure, for hospitals, schools, keeping the phone lines open, web chats open, so customers didn't feel or literally get disconnected. But also driving forward the construction and completing our huge offshore wind farm at East Anglia 1 to provide enough green power for another 600,000 homes across the country. But we've always known we need to do more and switch away from just responding tactically to the impacts of the pandemic. And we need to think more strategically about the medium and long term and how we then change and drive forward as an industry and as a country. And that requires us to get into a little bit of a different headspace and a different way of thinking, shifting from crisis mode to planning mode. But it's a conceptual leap we've started to make and we think we all need to make. Back in June, and by no means were we the first to do this, I'm quite sure we won't be the last to do it, but back in June, we moved to putting in place what we called a 10-point plan to unlock net zero. And the whole purpose of that plan was to put in place practical, implementable, pragmatic steps to start the green recovery and start shifting the investment and creating the jobs and building the infrastructure. I'm not going to take you through all of that 10-point plan because you can get a copy of it. We can send you a copy of it if you're interested. But it was all about driving forward the green recovery and helping us make that leap to getting started. Again, whether that's about investing in networks or in renewables or getting ready for electric transport or for clean heat, we absolutely know we need to do all of this and we need to find a way of delivering it and find a way of rolling out all of that infrastructure all the way through to people's homes. By and large, my view is we can get on with most of this and we can fund most of it without asking the government for money. We can do this through investment, through regulatory mechanisms, through competition, through frameworks. And that's a great advantage as well for the green recovery. It's not going to go with a begging bowl to the Treasury asking for more money, given the state the economy is in and the amount of borrowing we're already seeing in the country. The issue is just making sure we're allowed to get on and do it, and that the confidence there is to do it, and the ambition is there to do it, and that we've then got the integrity of the supporting frameworks and mechanisms to allow it to go on and be delivered. It was great and really important to hear the Prime Minister's recent speech and his commitment to the 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Fantastic news. Sounds a bit big, sounds a bit scary, but that's exactly what we need. Huge, ambitious targets. The first instalment of that is really about getting us towards net zero and kickstarting that recovery. And it sends exactly the right signal at exactly the right time. As an industry in the past, we've shown time and time again we can respond to those kind of big, bold targets. And if they're supported by the right mechanism, then we can deliver it. In fact, we can quite often blow the targets out of the water. So on the back of that announcement, my belief is we could really develop a massive supply chain feeding through to the whole of the renewable sector. We could bring on a whole load of apprenticeship and training opportunities. We can see huge investment going into coastal communities and into port infrastructure. And if you go back 10 years, no one dreamt offshore wind would be where it is today. It's achieved so much as a marketplace and so much as an industry. We were set targets, we annihilated the targets, both in terms of timeline and in terms of cost and in terms of innovation and in terms of the level of investment that's come through to the sector. Offshore wind is now one of the cheapest forms of renewable generation, and it's established a global industry. We have technologies coming through now like floating wind, and we're continuing to push all of the boundaries for the future of offshore wind. And I think the UK is in a great place. In fact, the UK quite rightly claim leadership across this industry and driving the whole industry forward. And that's a great place for us to be. But what's important now is that we also learn from that and take all of that to the future challenges around transport, around heat, around hydrogen, around industrial processes, and look at all of those great lessons we've learned from offshore wind. So again, I welcome also the government's review of the UK's approach to offshore transmission infrastructure. Sensible question for us to be asking, and a sensible question for us to look at. How do we get to that 40 gigawatts and make sure it's all properly connected to the energy system in the most efficient and effective way? We need to make sure we join up the dots between all of the parts of the energy system, whether it's wind farms onshore, offshore. There's no point in them being there in splendid isolation. We need to make sure we can connect them to the grid, and we need to make sure the network is there, capable of taking all of that energy, and it's resilient enough, and it's able to cope with it. If I was to have a concern right now about where we are as a country and where we are as an industry, is the risk of a mismatch between the government's scale and stated scale in terms of ambition and pace, and what actually lies underneath that in terms of the building blocks to allow it to be delivered, whether it's the planning system, whether it's the auction system, whether it's site licensing, whether it's the regulatory processes. Are they all absolutely aligned and working towards the same ambition? Because that's where we need to get to as a country. And right now, I don't think we're there. Now, back in June, point number 1 of our 10-point plan was all about the importance of investing in networks to meet the changes coming over the next decade. Otherwise, we'll end up with wind farm developments left in limbo, or we'll end up in a situation where we actually can't connect all of the EV charge points and the system can't cope with the pace of growth and the pace of delivery. Right now, we need to be increasing the level of investment in our networks, not slowing it down. We need to push and drive forward and make anticipatory investment, build the network for the future. It's absolutely critical to getting to net zero. And the prize is huge if we get that fixed. Over the next 10 to 15 years, I've said this before, we need to electrify the hell out of everything. That is the existing technology, it's the existing way to net zero, and we need to get on and do it and get on and deliver it to allow us to decarbonise the whole economy. I think most people are coming to the same conclusion. A green recovery kickstarts the economy, accelerates progress to net zero, and it's the right thing to do. It creates investments, it creates jobs, it creates a bigger supply chain, it creates training opportunities, and it gets our economy back up and running. So my message now is, let's just get on with it. If we work together, if we create a no surprises regulatory framework, if we ensure investment comes through, and we can get that transition, we can grow, we can move faster, and we can be certain again that we can smash all of the targets and beat all of the targets, whether it's the 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, whether it's every home being powered by offshore wind, whether it's the rollout of electric transport by 2030, we can beat every one of those targets if we get all of that right and we get everybody working together. So that's enough from me. Thank you. So without further ado, and with great pleasure, I am now going to hand over to Tracy Black, who's the Director of CBI Scotland, and we can hear from Tracy and her views and her perspective on the green recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you very much for having me here today and being part of a great lineup. What I'd really like to focus on is building back better, because the CBI is by no means the only organisation to have used that phrase in the past few months. The first thing to do is recognise where we are. It's no secret the Scottish, and the UK for that matter, economy is in a difficult place. Uncertainty is up, confidence is down, and the Scottish economy shrank by nearly a fifth between April and June. COVID-19 has been a devastating blow to Scottish businesses, not just the pubs, cafes and shops that you see so often on the news, but the manufacturers, the supply chains, and the family businesses just struggling to get by. And it's far from over yet. Just a few weeks ago, we were talking about reopening the economy and the route to recovery, with over 96% of businesses in Scotland back working, and business activity had picked up in all of our major centres. But I think we all recognise that recent spikes in transmission has made talk of an economic recovery a bit premature. The winter is going to be tough, and COVID will put huge pressure again on our NHS. The sad reality of all this is more lives will be lost, more businesses will close, and more redundancies will be announced. But we still have to talk about recovery, because the long-term impact of economic stagnation is terrible. High unemployment, widening inequality, generations lost, and long-term physical and mental ill health. To me, Build Back Better is about using this crisis as an opportunity to put in place policies that will stop that happening again. We need to build a fairer, greener, and more resilient Scotland. Some might say it's too difficult right now, but it's been done before. At the height of World War II, Churchill commissioned the Beveridge Report that led to the creation of the NHS and our modern welfare state. We need to use this critical moment, post-pandemic and in sight of a COP26 summit in Glasgow, to redouble our efforts towards a net zero future. We can't step back from it. We need to get practical about what can be done, and actions do speak louder than words. For so many, this feels like a world of fiercely competing goals, and we currently face two seemingly separate yet fundamental problems. COVID-19, the biggest public health crisis in living memory, and climate change, the defining challenge of the modern era. But if we look harder, they share many features in common, both global in nature, both disproportionately affecting the poorest in society, and both demanding urgent, coordinated action nationally and internationally. They're not really so separate after all. So for us, this is why a green recovery can help set a positive change, we hope, throughout the pandemic. The public's focus on tackling climate change has stayed strong. It's the same in business. Every day I talk to CEOs who are passionate about climate action, and I promise I'm not just talking about Keith. It's not just the moral component of taking action that's so striking, or the important point of not failing our children by leaving them with a climate catastrophe. It's the fact that so many of us see climate action as huge commercial opportunity too, and one that is perfectly geared towards Scotland and the Scottish economy. Energy generation is probably the most obvious one that comes to mind when we talk about Scotland. We have enormous legacy in energy production, from oil and gas to pioneering new forms of renewable energy, but we also have even more potential. Scotland's landscape is awash with wind farms, but we have tidal power, geothermal, hydroelectric, and though many of my friends south of the border might laugh, solar. The potential for jobs and opportunity in energy is massive. But there are other opportunities too. Take transport, for example. CBI Scotland has been clear that levelling up Scotland's transport and digital infrastructure is key to addressing sluggish productivity and investing now that can really help our recovery. What we need to ensure is we achieve that through a green infrastructure revolution, with a focus on electric cars, zero carbon trains, buses and ferries, and invest in active travel. But that requires investment, and where we invest, we create jobs. To achieve that, we need better working between the Scottish and UK government and an acceleration of key decision making. I completely agree with Keith's comment about how we need to make big, bold decisions and get on with them. Transforming connectivity in Scotland can't wait for us to wade through arduous planning processes. One of the other opportunities is a significant energy efficiency drive, with a focus on decarbonising heat in our homes and commercial business buildings. Heat is the largest single source of carbon emissions, accounting for over 1/3. Half of this comes from our domestic buildings, the majority of which are heated by natural gas boilers. Our goal is to phase out all fossil fuel heating systems by 2050, but that will take a huge change in the skills that our current engineers have. The CBI has suggested an Olympic-style delivery body that could coordinate that effort, bringing both national and local stakeholders on board. An energy efficiency programme would provide a huge boost for the economy at a time when the new career opportunities are needed more than ever. An analysis presented by National Grid estimates that during the decade of 2031 to 2040, the UK will need 152,000 new jobs in the net zero workforce. But one of the biggest things we need to power both a net zero future and a green recovery is developing the right skills. But it's also a massive challenge. Before we started talking about a green recovery, before we'd even heard of COVID-19, people were hugely concerned about the issue of automation. How do we make sure that technological change can be seen as an opportunity and not a threat to the workforce? To make sure that huge swathes of the workforce aren't bypassed by increased automation and AI without having access to the upskilling and retraining they need for the jobs of the future. If you want to understand the urgency of the problem, just think about these stats, all pre-COVID. Despite its increasing importance, the proportion of employees undertaking job-related training has fallen sharply in recent years. Scotland ranks 3rd out of the 4 UK nations on that front. 9 in 10 workers are set to need some form of reskilling by 2030, and 1 in 6 workers will go through a radical job change and need retraining. And even more critically, 80% of the workforce of 2030 are already in work today. But if we get that process right, by identifying which jobs we think are sustainable in the long term, and then ensuring workers have access to upskilling and retraining options we need, we can avoid those job losses and make sure that the jobs that do disappear are high labour, low-skilled and low-pay manual jobs. The Scottish Government's announcement of a National Transition Training Fund is a step in the right direction. It's a £25 million fund to help 10,000 people aged 25 and over to develop the skills required to move into sectors with the greatest potential for future growth and job opportunities. Jobs in the green economy, whether in sustainable transport, low carbon energy production, clearly fall into that category. There should be a focus on bringing together clusters of companies in these sectors with a strong future to agree what skills they need and support them to work together in a skills academy with our fantastic higher education establishment that Scotland is so lucky to have. Green energy can lead the way on that, and the Transition Training Fund was announced in response to the current economic crisis, but we have the potential to create a model there that can be built on for years to come. Apprenticeships will also continue to be hugely important, and there are a range available in Scotland, but we need to see greater partnership between business, government and the education sector to make sure a full suite of options are available to meet an individual's needs as well as Scotland's skills needs overall. So in conclusion, while the COVID-19 crisis has been devastating to the economy, it really hasn't created many new long-term problems. Low productivity, coping with automation, delivering next generation, meeting ambitious climate commitments and upskilling Scotland's workforces are challenges that all existed pre-COVID. The pandemic has just put them in sharper focus. Even before the pandemic, Scotland was in need of a compelling economic vision that business can invest in. To make our quest for net zero a key component of growing the Scottish economy, we must leverage what we're best at, exploiting our competitive advantage and driving ahead with innovation. And skills are critical to underpinning our journey. And the upskilling that would help us cope with increased automation is the very same upskilling and retraining that will help us access the skills needed to power a higher growth net zero economy. For what's needed, you just need to look at the North East. You only need to set foot in Aberdeen these days and you hear discussion about a just transition from oil and gas and turning legacy jobs from fossil fuels into future-proof opportunities for the long term. But it won't happen without support, and that's where business and government both need to play a role. Thank you. Keith, you're actually on mute. I think people are trying to tell you. Sorry, I didn't realize you could hear me. So sorry, I'm sitting here with you.
sitting here speaking to myself. How
after 8 months, we still haven't learned.
Sadly, that's not very unusual. There you go. Happens all the time. I'm going mad, clearly. Right, thank you.
Second take.
I'll say, I was saying such nice things about you as well, Tracy, about how fantastic you were. So just a reminder to everybody, as you listen through the presentations, it'll trigger thoughts and questions in your mind. So please jot them down, put them on the system. There's a function there for you to ask questions, and we'll have a debate at the end. So without further ado, though, let's move on to Sir Jim McDonald, who is the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of Strathclyde. Jim.
And Keith, if you were talking to yourself, I can only hope that you were getting a sensible answer. But let me now reflect on the matter in hand this morning. First of all, may I say a big congratulations to Judith and the Reid team for putting this together, given the constraints today, and it's great to be back at All Energy. I'm going to give you some reflections on the role of engineering and how it makes contributions to the green recovery. Keith's told you that my day job is at Strathclyde, but I'm really speaking to you as an engineer and as President of the Royal Academy of Engineering. I would like to reflect, firstly, that this week marks the 14th anniversary since the publication of the Stern Report, which I commend to you. It was written by the then Sir Nick Stern, now Lord Stern, who's a professor at the London School of Economics, on the economics of climate change. And if I give one quote from that report, it was that climate change is the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. So in many ways, this convergence between economy, policy, the need for sustainable approaches to living in this world and driving it through innovation and investment is absolutely key. There were three main points of recommendation from the Stern Report that are still entirely relevant around carbon pricing, energy efficiency, some of which you've heard about already this morning, and technology policy, which I'll say a little bit about this morning, where the Stern Report recommended, and there has been some actions on this over the past decade or so, and an increasing investment in energy R&D, deploying low carbon technologies, and the Stern Report recommended a 5 times multiplier on supporting that deployment and acceleration to use through large scale pilot programs, for example, and that technology policy should be done at scale and at pace, and you heard that from Keith more generally. And I mention Nick Stern because it's my pleasure currently to be working quite closely with him. I sit on the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology in my capacity as President of the Royal Academy of Engineering. And I want to use the recent letter from CST, as it's called, to the Prime Minister as an entree to a few things that I'm going to say to you. So in January, CST submitted a letter of advisory content to the Prime Minister, accompanied by a series of very detailed recommendations. The Prime Minister responded very positively to that, and I would suggest to you, you may have a look at the UK government website and look for the CST report on net zero and taking a systems approach to it. And that's what I want to talk to you about in the first part of my presentation, because that systems engineering approach is key. The advice majored on achieving net zero through a whole systems approach, inspired by using systems engineering. So we have the UK and, of course, Scottish Government making a commitment for 2045. Our proud city of Glasgow, you'll hear more about from Susan Aitken making big commitments around 2030, but we won't be able to achieve that unless we move fast, we move at pace, and we move in a coordinated way, which is fed by evidence, data, analysis, then concerted investment. So achieving net zero will require fundamental changes in society and the economy, but given the long timescales required to get innovation, for example, into individual homes and businesses, and the scale of behaviour change that we need from individuals, communities and institutions, we really need to start now. And I've been saying, as many others have for the past decade, we need to start now. But with the 2050 commitments, really, there is no alternative but to move in a broad front and move together. And because of that, we should not only rely on the invention of new breakthrough technologies to achieve net zero by 2050. That's what I do as a researcher. Of course, that's important, and many of these new technologies will arise over the next 30 years or so. But the challenge today is to put in place the right infrastructure and to implement and improve known and emerging technologies at scale. The sort of projects that Keith's talked about, whether it's a wholesale multiplier, quadrupling, for example, offshore wind, and riding the advances in technological innovation on these larger, better, and more efficient devices as they go into the water, but using this also to challenge policy decisions that are required to drive change across the whole system. So the CST letter basically challenged government, as it were, to use a disciplined and rigorous whole systems approach to delivering a better transition towards the net zero emission targets, and that a rigorous approach should be taken. And that's because decision makers have to understand how different policies interact and influence the transition of the whole economy towards net zero. So for me as an engineer, I see a complex system, a lot of key interdependencies, but if we do the analysis, understand the interconnectivity, and then we optimize the investments and get moving. We're never going to have a perfect answer to get started with, but for sure we won't get to where we need to be unless we move now and get projects underway and start making the transition and the investments that are required around it. So the three broad headlines of recommendation from CST that we had to strengthen the institutions and the governance frameworks, and indeed the leadership structures. We've perhaps heard that a little bit, but we need to stress this is about leadership in government, leadership in industry, and leadership to create the collaborations and the risky but high reward moves as we try to move towards net zero in 2050. And we need that cultural change across central government to galvanise action to achieve net zero. So there's a challenge back in to the public sector as well to get greater coherence at the national level and through devolved governments into the city regions as well. We also are very keen through CST that we develop further analytical capability, better flows of information, better data to inform decision making and investments, and de-risk industry's ability to engage these large investment in projects, and the reporting needed to inform decisions. The Energy Systems Catapult, for example, is an excellent example of part of the innovation system in the UK, driving scenario-led recommendations, but also using data to inform and underpin decision-making. And finally, to maximise the contributions of technology, to mobilise financial systems, because none of this will happen without commitment to investment, public sector facilitation, and of course, private sector commitment, investment. And that's easy to say, more difficult to achieve, and ultimately to galvanise international collaboration. At the Royal Academy of Engineering, we've also established a very senior working group involving members of industry, many of whom you would recognise by name and by reputation, by looking at net zero and taking a systems perspective on the climate change. And within the Royal Academy of Engineering, we host the National Engineering Policy Centre that involves all of the professional engineering institutions in the UK, representing almost 500,000 professional engineers, a real powerhouse of engineering knowledge. And increasingly, we're mapping that technical know-how to informing policy and investment decisions. Because we need to remember, the UK has less than 1,600 weeks to meet the target of net zero in territorial emissions. And it's a massive undertaking. It will involve simultaneous transformation of several vital interconnected infrastructure systems, from transport and housing to energy and manufacturing. It requires developing whole new industries to maturity and supporting sweeping societal, cultural and behavioural and structural change, i.e. a major complex system that requires systems engineering to address it. The Academy, through the National Engineering Policy Centre, has already tried to elaborate by choosing key sectors. For example, in the decarbonisation of homes, a real thorny challenge, but where we can get a great deal of gain. So decarbonisation of homes and a more broadly set of direct emissions controls come and need to be embedded in the built environment. This is one of the largest and most difficult issues associated with decarbonisation. Homes accounted for 18% of territorial emissions in the UK in 2018, primarily from natural gas use for heating and cooking. And that figure does not include indirect emissions from electricity supply. So if we look at that system perspective, we have to look at retrofitting of heating systems and energy efficiency measures, the recycling and repurposing of existing infrastructure like gas boilers, for example, new build houses that must be compatible with future heating solutions, right through to future zero carbon transport requirements, urbanisation and land use and biodiversity. So if we look at, again, from a systems perspective, a lot of actors and stakeholders in that system, from homeowners themselves, landlords, tenants, housing and tenants associations, local authorities, builders and developers, utilities, regulatory and standards bodies, which I'll say a little bit briefly about in a moment, devolved governments, etc., right through to the technologists. So again, by decomposing that system, understanding where the dependencies are, and then moving to action, that's key. Complex systems, there are structured methods to deal with this. And the last thing I'll say at this part of the discussion is that we have seen this UK government continue to emphasise the need to accelerate economic growth through innovation and R&D. Importantly, and all that I've heard them say, with net zero at the heart of that strategic commitment. There's been a raft of new publications over the past 6 months. One or two I would commend to you, particularly the UK R&D roadmap that's highlighted, for example, Glasgow, the Strathclyde University ecosystem around innovation, the offshore renewable energy catapult, other commitments that the city is making. But we also have a place strategy emerging through the levelling up agenda. So as we build towards net zero in 2050, let's do that across the UK. Let's understand the role of our city here in Glasgow, whether it's through the devolved administrations, but certainly through the concerted effort nationally. And a couple of important underlying numbers to remember. We have a target of increasing investment in the UK's R&D from 1.7% of GDP to 2.4% by 2027. That was a stretch, and it's even more challenging given the impacts of COVID, but nonetheless, it's a key target for driving economic growth. That will represent somewhere around £15 billion additional investment in R&D over the coming years, with a longer-term goal of 3%. And there is a clear commitment to double the UK government's investment in innovation activity to £22 billion per annum by 2024. Now that's key. And the last thing I will say is that there are several mechanisms that the engineers have seen and that we've informed government have to be looked at that has to be thought about. We've engaged very strongly with industry, particularly engineering and technology industries, and we've talked to CTOs, CEOs of a whole raft of multi-sector companies, I should say. And these interviews raise two clear baskets of opportunities. One, building on strengths, some of which you heard from Tracy, but also actions needed. And I'll conclude by saying, where are our strengths in the UK and certainly in Scotland? Well, the engineering workforce is strong, but there are demographic challenges and we need to continue to produce colleagues everywhere from the technical scale, apprenticeships, through to the highest level of engineering competence, right through to postgraduate level. Innovation funding is good, and it's being doubled down on. Non-financial innovation support is good. Collaboration with universities, good. It's a key in the UK, but needs to be even better. Collaboration between businesses and tax incentives. But where we really need action is late-stage development and demonstrators. That's what de-risks investment for industry, and that's where we can do things at scale. I was in a meeting with Sir Ian Wood just last night. The energy transition zone that's proposed in Aberdeen, exactly an example of how we might accelerate through innovation, R&D, new industrial opportunities. Public procurement needs to be reviewed quickly to support innovation. Joined up government approach and more, not least of which through the regulators. So I will conclude, Keith, by saying a couple of things. The systems engineering approach is key to prioritising action, understanding key dependencies and delivering projects. Scale and pace are key. You've heard a little bit about the Scottish Power 10-point plan. I think that encapsulates much of what needs to be done. Leadership coordination is key. Public sector and government, industrial and other independent actors such as in our universities, and collaboration and innovation at the heart of it. And if I conclude by paraphrasing in the celebration of the anniversary of the Stern report, let me paraphrase Nick Stern. What we've been doing over the past 10 years has been having a limited effect on the climate. What we do in the next 10 years can have a profound effect on the climate in the second half of this century. So let's engineer the future now. Let's move towards net zero at scale and at pace. And finally, let's build economic opportunity as we do the right thing. Thanks, Keith.
Brilliant. Thank you, as always, Jim. That's fantastic. I always love having you on these panels. You're not just an academic, but an engineer. So you bring logic, rationale, a systems approach, leadership. And then I just end up, you know what, we should just put you in charge. I think.
Be careful what you wish for.
No, it's fine. I'll put you in charge and then I'll emigrate. No, that was great. Loads and loads of stuff packed in there. Really, really brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And again, I'm sure that will trigger lots of questions and lots of thoughts from people watching. So we'll quickly and keep moving on. We're going to hand over now to Angus McCrone, who's Chief Editor of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And without a doubt, I would say Angus, in terms of journalism, in terms of editors, is the best informed, most knowledgeable energy journalist, editor out there by a long, long way, and brings a really great perspective always to these conversations and these debates, and has some brilliant insights about the market, finance, and the function of this and the delivery of it all. So really looking forward to what you've got to add to this debate. Angus, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Keith. I'm overwhelmed by the introduction. I hope I can at least half live up to it. So I was just going to talk about what's happening in 2020, because obviously it's been a pretty dire year for everybody in many ways. And things have been going on in the sort of green economy, which are really quite remarkable and probably haven't been picked up. So we talk about green recovery, and in a way, the green recovery has been going on all year already, and the momentum is very strong. So I'm hoping that people will be able to see my slides. So let's look at what's happening in 2020. The first way we'll look at that is through the trends in clean energy investment globally. This is our chart showing investment in each half-year period in billions of dollars. And what you can see in recent years is a pretty steady trend, of some half years being stronger than others, but generally speaking, steady. And that steady is very good, because actually costs have been falling rapidly during the whole period. So wind and solar have been getting much cheaper, and yet the numbers of billions of dollars invested has remained remarkably steady. So that means more and more capacity is being added all the time. And for me, the sort of most striking thing is that the first half of 2020, when virtually every economy in the world ground to a halt, that didn't stop the momentum in the clean energy sector at all. In fact, investment in the first half of the year was stronger than it was in the first half of last year. One of the, perhaps the most spectacular driver of that performance in the first half was the offshore wind sector. And we saw record investment in offshore wind globally in the first half of 2020 compared to any other half-year period, $35 billion worldwide. Quite extraordinary development, really. It wasn't just sort of Europe, or it wasn't just China. It was really quite widely spread. Here's a sort of screen shot of our database looking at some of the largest deals that came through in offshore wind. So the Seagreen project in Firth of Forth in Scotland is the largest one in terms of dollars invested, the largest single deal. But you can see really big deals going through there in Taiwan, France, and China. So there's a real geographical spread going on. Those markets are all very active. So are several other European markets. Asian markets also becoming a lot more interesting. Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and North America hasn't even got started yet properly, but we're expecting big things from the North American program. So what about the UK picture? This is UK investment in renewable energy capacity year by year, and we've only got the first half of 2020 there, so the number for the full year will be a lot stronger than that. Why was the figure so strong in the middle of the decade? Well, that was a sort of tail end of the ROC scheme, the feed-in tariff for solar, and then the beginning of the CFD program. So those kind of events came together and drove a lot of a bit of a rush to invest in both onshore wind and solar. And of course, it was at higher costs than are achievable now. So the sort of the dollar or pound figures invested look particularly strong then. What we've seen is it's slowed down in more recent years, but in the first half of 2020, it was quite a decent figure, supported by offshore wind to a large extent, with also some contribution there from biomass and waste, some solar merchant projects coming through now, and also that's starting to happen with onshore wind too. This is a quite extraordinary chart, I think, of the last year, showing what's happening with clean energy shares against world oil company shares. So for a lot of the last decade, clean energy shares underperformed because it's a very competitive sector, hard to make a lot of money, particularly on the manufacturing side. But what we've seen in the 12 months to mid-September was clean energy shares on the NEX index outperforming the NYSE Arca oil index by no less than 100 percentage points. So that's quite extraordinary for the investor point of view. Clean energy shares outperformed by 100 percentage points. And then one result of this, but also a cause to some extent, is hugely increased investor interest in clean energy shares and in the idea of a sort of green transformation in the world economy. So exchange traded funds are one of the ways in which investors can put money into particular markets without having to choose individual shares. And what you can see with the purple line is that the number of shares outstanding in clean energy ETFs went up very sharply during the 12-month period. So there's a lot more money coming in. And equally, the market cap is the blue line, the lighter blue line. So there was a lot more money coming in, and share prices were going up in the sector. And the end result was that the value of these ETFs globally quadrupled in value in the space of just 1 year. And amazing things were going on in with electric vehicles. So this is the amount of money raised by quoted EV companies on stock markets. And the 2020 figure is only up to mid-September. So extraordinary amount of money raised by EV companies, led by Tesla, but many other companies raised money as well. Some of them by special acquisition companies, or SPACs. So this is something that's been going on Wall Street, where an entity is floated without a sort of particular business, and then buys up an underlying business, and that's a kind of simple way for that underlying business to end up on public stock markets without having to do an IPO itself. So huge amounts of money have been raised. Some of it's probably a bit excessive in terms of how many companies can be successful in the new EV world, but nevertheless a remarkable result, I think. What's been happening with policy, very briefly? Some major commitments being made during the COVID crisis. So the European Commission raising its climate ambition, now looking for a 55% cut in emissions by 2030. Big change there, and that will necessitate a lot of policy action and a lot of investment action. California to ban new gasoline cars by 2035. Michigan also looking to go carbon neutral by 2050. And then, of course, the biggest one of all really was China, kind of out of the blue, really, saying that they want to be net zero by 2060. So it's a bit later than some of the Western countries, but still remarkable given China's dependence on coal-fired power in particular, the importance of its industry, the heat that's required to fuel that industry, and so on. And then, of course, in the UK, Boris Johnson talking about wind farms powering every home by 2030. So it's a statement. It's not the underlying policy that would make that happen, but it's important that governments are being ambitious and setting their sights on big targets for the future. So this is just something looking at that EU revised target by 2030. So it was going to be a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 compared to 1990 baseline. They're now looking for 55. So it is a major change of the sort of velocity of change that the EU is talking about, and it's going to require considerable policy action to incentivize that. There is an EU green stimulus proposal of $644 billion, which will help towards that. This is a sort of global stimulus picture. As you can see, there's a lot of stimulus that's going to happen, and this may come out in the discussion later, which is not green around the world. So we've listed this as approved stimulus for CO2 intensive industries globally. So there's a lot of that, and a much smaller amount of actual green stimulus. But there is some green stimulus. The EU's been the most ambitious so far, and there's a lot of momentum generally behind the sector in an underlying way. And then just finally, this is, we published our big forecast for the energy system out to 2050 just last week. And some very interesting numbers in that, one of which is that the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to have saved the world 2.5 years in terms of emissions. So it has had disastrous health effects, of course, and economic effects. But in terms of achieving climate targets, it makes the battle slightly more feasible than it was before. And I suppose there's a little bit of comfort in that. The forecast also continues to show really huge increases in the use of wind and solar globally, towards 50% of global generation by 2050 on the basis purely of economics, relative economics in terms of generation sources. So it's not based on any new policy changes. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Keith.
Okay, fine. Sorry, I've seemed to have lost my screen. Can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, fine. Blue Angus, brilliant as always. Thank you, and some fantastic slides there, fantastic data points for everybody to look at and again think about in terms of questions going forward. That's brilliant. So our final speaker, last but not least, is Councillor Susan Aitken, who is responsible for the great city of Glasgow, and that's one of the fantastic things about Glasgow was the ambition it set itself in terms of becoming a net zero city, and Susan's always taken a really great leadership position on doing that, and also been a massive supporter and host of the All Energy Conference. So Susan, it's brilliant to have you here again with us. I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Keith, and thanks again to All Energy for asking me to join you today. All Energy has become such an important mainstay, I think, on Glasgow's calendar. That it is a bit odd, even though we're used now over the past few months to doing events virtually. It is a bit disappointing that we're having to do this particular event as a virtual summit. I think sharing a stage in person can sometimes send that a really powerful message, as it did last year when Keith and myself announced our shared commitment to overcoming the challenges of Glasgow's built form to increase the use of electric vehicles in the city. But there's no question that we've discovered that the virtual event has come into its own over the past few months, and it's become vital for us in Glasgow in nurturing shared agendas on climate action. And especially in recent weeks, it's been invaluable in projecting Glasgow further onto the world stage. Events that I would have struggled to attend in person, whether they've been hosted from Singapore, Santiago, or closer to home, Strathclyde University, we've been able to plug into an increasingly important global network of our peer cities. And as such, Glasgow's profile is really accelerating. Our peers want to know about the city, our agendas and our ambitions, and they want to share in and collaborate on, crucially, those critical policy discussions. They want to find common cause on solutions to global climate challenges. There's a real unity of purpose emerging, I think, among city governments and subnational governments, which has the potential to be one of the single biggest contributors to the well-being and indeed the survival of our planet. And of course, our role as host to COP26 has thrust Glasgow into these spotlights. Today's All Energy Summit adds to the momentum as we arrive at that 1 year to go milestone. And the point that's increasingly crystallised at every single online event that I've been participating in on behalf of the city is the absolutely critical role of cities in the race to zero. It is where the race is won. Nation states pledge, but cities deliver. And perhaps unlike any previous COP, the voices of cities will be heard very loudly at COP26. You all know the context, of course. Over half the world's population lives in cities. Cities are also where we do most of our work, travelling, socialising, and they generate the bulk of the world's emissions. They also set the pace for economic, social and cultural change. And Glasgow is just such a city, and our story is the world story, from the carbon-intensive past to the low carbon and sustainable developments of the present and the future. So we're an ideal location for COP26, and I'm really glad that our fellow global cities are recognising that. And it's a source of pride for me when I tell them that our net zero carbon target date is 2030, 15 years ahead of Scotland's national target and 20 ahead of the UK's. And that's no small ambition for a post-industrial city with all of the physical and social legacy that that brings. But being prepared to take on the biggest challenges brings us the biggest rewards in terms of emissions reduction. What's also evident from all of these events is that the responses to the climate emergency, which we already knew was upon us, and the responses to the largely unforeseen and unplanned for COVID pandemic are becoming as conjoined as the actual challenges themselves, and that the immediate COVID responses show that cities can change faster and more fundamentally than previously thought or attempted, which takes away even more of any excuses that we reduction targets. So in Glasgow, that's got to mean driving forward our efforts to support short-term COVID recovery, but also the medium and longer-term needs of tackling deep-rooted deprivation and responding to the climate emergency. All of those things are conjoined for us in the city. And if Scotland as a whole is to address those long-standing issues that we've seen exacerbated by COVID-19, then Glasgow must lead the way. A genuine modern metropolis like the Glasgow City region, which is Scotland's economic powerhouse, is where both the challenges and the opportunities for carbon neutrality, but also for social and economic renewal lie. A green recovery, one that responds to COVID, creates an economic stimulus, helps the city adapt to and mitigate against climate change, and improves general well-being isn't reinventing the wheel. And I think we've heard that point made very strongly in the presentations that we've already heard. Much of this work, the work that we need to accelerate now, is responding to issues which we already had and challenges that we already had, but which have been brought into even sharper focus by COVID. I want to briefly give two examples to illustrate that particular point. The need for safe physical distancing in our city centre and in neighbourhoods as lockdown eased earlier in the summer added critical urgency to ongoing work in Glasgow to make our streets more people focused. The significant uptake of walking and cycling by Glaswegians pointed to an unfolding cultural shift, and the necessary infrastructure had to be put in place and put in place quickly. So, supported by Scottish Government funding, we implemented Spaces for People, and indeed we are still implementing it across the city, reallocating road space for walking, cycling and wheeling, providing many hospitality businesses with outside space for safe trade, and encouraging citizens to re-engage with the social and economic life of the city with confidence that the public health concerns were being addressed. But that's also allowed citizens to really see and consider what a cleaner and greener Glasgow, one that relegates the private car and builds on work that was already unfolding through the redesign of our key thoroughfares like the Avenues programme. It's allowed them not just to imagine what that might be, but actually get a real sense of what it looks like in their day-to-day lives. Similarly, we've committed to a timetable to transform our key civic space, George Square, by removing the vast majority of traffic that currently accesses it. That process is also already underway. We've pedestrianised two ends of that square. The redesign of our streetscapes, though, it doesn't only respond to COVID, but of course it lays the infrastructure for a shift towards the decarbonisation of transport and for a city centre going through increasingly rapid structural changes, again, which have been accelerated by the impact of the pandemic. It has helped a bit to restore confidence, vibrancy and prosperity while creating the momentum for a healthier, more accessible, attractive and resilient future. Although, and Tracy underlined the scale of the economic impact, we do still have a long way to go in that respect. I expect some of you also, and I hope in fact some of you will be aware of the Clyde mission, which is truly a once in a generation opportunity to continue the regeneration of Glasgow's largest centre of economic activity, Glasgow city centre, home to 170,000 jobs, which is the largest concentration of jobs anywhere in Scotland, as well as some of our nation's most deprived areas, those which have been most severely impacted by COVID-19. Again, there's much existing work to build on, a track record of major international investors attracted to waterfront locations, a burgeoning financial district, Scotland's biggest and most ambitious current regeneration project, Clyde Gateway, and the confluence of 3 innovation districts surrounded by our leading universities. And we've already heard from Jim about the city centre innovation district led by the University of Strathclyde. But the Clyde corridor remains possibly the biggest untapped development potential area in the whole of Europe. And unlocking that potential means reinstating historic areas of vacant and derelict land, addressing emerging flood issues through investment in intervention schemes, and tapping the considerable and as yet largely unexploited renewable energy potential of the river. And all of that can be a catalyst for recovery across many communities, as well as sending a strong signal of intent to private sector partners and colleagues. A major transformational infrastructure project like the Clyde Mission and its individual shovel-ready projects that come under that overall umbrella will help to drive recovery. But it can also help address the major macro challenges, that whole systems approach of stimulus, adaptation, mitigation, social justice, and inclusive growth that must underscore the green recovery. Clyde Mission is an exciting project, and it addresses all of those factors. And it's a key reason why it's figuring so largely in the city and the wider city regions submission to the Scottish Government's National Advisory Group on Economic Recovery, and indeed why those submissions have been so well received so far. As Glasgow continues to raise our profile through our international networks, our central message is that social justice must be an equal consideration in our response to COVID and in our response to the climate emergency. And I'll repeat that message here today. Fairness must be at the core of those combined priorities. Climate change already threatens to have a disproportionate impact on young people and on our poorest communities, and COVID is exacerbating that. The young people of 2020, as we know, are facing challenges and issues that have not been experienced to the same extent or in the same way by previous generations, whether that's in threats to their mental and physical health, difficulties entering an unprecedentedly challenging job market, or in accessing social and cultural opportunities. My niece had her 18th birthday just a couple of weeks ago, and it was an 18th birthday in which she couldn't see any friends, she couldn't go out and socialise, she couldn't go to a club, she couldn't go to a restaurant, she couldn't even go inside the home of her granny and grandpa or her aunt and uncle. And that in many ways sums up the loss of freedom that our current young generation are experiencing, that people of my generation and others took so much for granted. But climate change has a similarly disproportionate impact on low-income groups, those who contribute least to greenhouse gas emissions, but are also least able to prepare, respond and recover from its impacts. And that's as true on a city or indeed community scale as it is on a global one. The City Council's own climate emergency report is explicit in its concerns about the impact on jobs that an economy moving away from its dependency on fossil fuels will have. And I've spoken many times of the need to protect workers from the shocks of transition and to maximise opportunities for the future workforce. That won't happen on its own. It's going to take planning and engagement with both businesses and trade unions. A just transition needs direction and it needs supportive partners. So council colleagues are currently refining and consulting on how we make that localised just transition happen. A transition that actively plans for Glasgow's carbon neutral economy, which focuses on those most vulnerable to climate change and which creates opportunities for the currently under or unemployed in the trades and professions that a more sustainable economy will demand. All of us here recognise that the race to zero and delivering a green recovery will need collaboration like never before. The just transition will need partnership as much, perhaps even more so, than any of the issues that we've already coalesced around. When our plans have been concluded and agreed, and I fully anticipate that our just transition work streams will be well underway by the time All Energy meets again in May, not least by the time of COP26. I hope that together we can revisit this critical recovery agenda, which our three previous speakers have already outlined in such compelling detail, how crucial that is for those aligned and combined agendas of addressing the climate emergency and recovering from COVID, summed up in the term of green recovery. So to conclude, that green recovery must and will be mainstreamed into really everything that we do in Glasgow. How housing developments meet our needs on fuel poverty, carbon zero targets, skills, jobs and economic stimulus. How community wealth building relates to social enterprise, the circular economy, local food strategies and much more. And how the digital divide must be bridged as well. It's the overriding priority for city leadership and not simply political leadership. As council leader, also convener for Inclusive Economic Growth, chair of the Glasgow Economic Recovery Group, Sustainable Glasgow and the Glasgow City Region Cabinet, I certainly have my own work cut out, but so do all of the other partners in the city who are involved in those groups. And as Tracy and Jim and Angus have already compellingly outlined, we need to further explore with increasing urgency how climate and COVID relate to those further oncoming challenges and opportunities, such as those presented by Brexit and by the advance of artificial intelligence and automation. Sustainability, reducing Glasgow's carbon emissions and social justice are threaded throughout our plans for economic recovery. Like everyone here, I hope that we can soon move forward from COVID-19 and fully onto COP26. We have a tremendous opportunity to drive policy and investment towards a green recovery and create a new economic future, not just for Glasgow, but for Scotland and beyond. So it was disappointing we were unable to meet in person today, but I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to come together in person for next May's All Energy Conference, and even more hopeful that I'll be able to welcome you to the SEC for COP26 next November, when the future of our planet will be at stake, perhaps as never before. Thanks very much for listening.
Susan, thank you as always, and some fantastic issues, challenges and points raised there, and particularly the whole agenda of fairness and how, it's easy for us to kind of get lost in the installation of charge points and the building of wind farms and electrifying buses and forget about the whole agenda of fairness and the importance of that around, whether it's city communities or regional communities. It's an incredibly important part of what we need to try and do and make sure that, that great political phrase of levelling up the economy, make sure that everybody is getting access and fair access to what happens on decarbonisation, but also that in terms of jobs and the economic impacts of it get shared right across the whole of the country and all of the communities. So thank you for that. Now we're going to move to Q&A. Thank you. We have been swamped with questions and far too many for us to answer. I've tried to group some of them together, and we're going to try and make this as interactive as is possible with the wonders of virtual technology. But I'm just going to kick off with partly a question that's come through some other people, but I've kind of wrapped up into one thing, which is, if you, the panelists, if you were Prime Minister or First Minister, because we're not going to get political, if you were Prime Minister or First Minister for a day, what is the one thing you would do and the one decision you would make just now that you think would be absolutely critical to kick-starting and making the green recovery a reality? And I'm gonna pick on Jim. You go first, Jim.
Well, thanks for that, Keith. Well, I would choose to do a few things, but a quick answer given the time. One thing that the Council for Science and Technology did say to the Prime Minister at the start of the year, Keith, and I suspect you might agree with this as well, is that government should require that all regulators develop an explicit first-order objective to support the transition to net zero by 2050, and that has to be designed to support innovation and its implementation. So in broad terms, alignment within government, and that's national government, devolved government, and city government, such as Susan leads so well here in Glasgow. So alignment and regulators acknowledging and helping facilitate key government policy imperatives.
Perfect. Angus, what about from your point of view?
Well, as I was trying to argue earlier, there's a lot of momentum going on particularly in decarbonising power, and also it's a little bit behind, but decarbonising transport. There's an enormous amount happening already, and the economics are all sort of pointing towards that continuing. So I think what government needs to focus on is doing the utmost to keep those going as quickly as possible. So that means, for instance, in the area of transport, looking at vehicle emission regulations and so on, and putting in the infrastructure on electric vehicle charging. But it also means doing the R&D groundwork in the hard to abate sectors. So, hydrogen may be important, or maybe less important, some people think. CCS may be important or not. We don't know any of this. But the groundwork needs to be done on those technologies, on researching and developing them and getting costs down. So the government should be doing its utmost in this decade to work on that, so that we can start addressing the hard to abate sectors, particularly from the 2030s onwards.
Perfect. No, good. Thank you, Tracy. I'm going to tweak the question slightly
for you. I
just
have an
I know
answer.
you've been sitting there preparing an answer, and I've just blown it out of the water for you. Look, just a slight tweak to it, but we often hear everybody wax lyrical about the huge supply chain opportunities and getting a whole load of new companies involved. So again, just same idea, but what is it we need to do to make that a reality? How do we actually get that to happen, as opposed to just talking about it?
Well, I think you and I have talked a lot about this, is how do you give that confidence out to the business community to actually invest, whether that's in the new technology or invest in training the staff. So my initial answer is going to be, I think you lead by example. So I would say that all public sector buildings, transport, and commit to whether that's 2030, 2035 are going to be net zero. And I think by the public sector guaranteeing those sort of opportunities, if you like, to get involved, would then stimulate the businesses to do the training of the engineers, the construction sector, etc., all together, because there's a guaranteed pipeline there. And we're seeing some great examples already. I found out Scottish Water are one of the biggest users, if not the biggest users of energy in Scotland, but they're also doing some fantastic projects to take the energy that they also create and turn it around. So I think public sector can create that pipeline that business can then get behind and put the money, where the opportunities are.
Brilliant. And Susan, just coming to you again, just a slight change to the context of the question, and it relates to some of the stuff you were saying, but often people talk about decarbonising transport, and we get into wonderful debates about the electric car and electric car charge points, which is fine, for some people, and it's fine for some of those. But I suppose the challenge of public transport, in terms of how do we convert public transport and decarbonise it, but also just given what's happened during the pandemic, that's lumped another massive challenge on top of public transport, where people appear to be more reluctant to use it. So what is it you think we need to do to get people back into public transport? And what is it we need to do to get that public transport, whether it's buses or trains, all electrified?
Yes, it's a huge concern for me, actually, that that public transport is being seen as part of the problem when it comes to transmission of COVID. And I'm really concerned that people won't go back. Glasgow is a city that has less than 50% car ownership. So public transport and the use of public transport and public transport connectivity is a huge issue for us economically, social justice issue, incredibly important. So we do need to get people back and to give them that confidence. I think part of the answer is intervention by government, both at national and local level, and what my answer would have been to the original question is that that national governments should empower local government more. We heard a lot from all of the presentations, I think, about the critical need for pace of delivery, and the reality is local government can move faster. On so much of this, we can go faster, but we at the moment don't have the resource or the powers that we need. But clearly, what we need to do to give people confidence to get back on buses and trains again, I think buses in particular, is frankly have more of them running. Have more routes, so that they're more accessible, that people don't feel that they're overcrowded, because public transport absolutely is a crucial part of the solution for decarbonisation, for decarbonising transport overall, particularly in a city like Glasgow. So we need to turn that narrative around, where public transport just now is seen as a risk to public health by a lot of people. Public transport has to be an enabler and supporter of public health, which indeed it is. And I think once we get through our current period of COVID and that part of the cycle where we do appear to be in a second wave just now, I would like that to be a priority for government at all levels, that we start to incentivise people to get back on buses and trains again, and the underground in Glasgow.
All right, thank you. Next topic, and there's a number of questions coming related to this as well, which is the whole topic of innovation. And Angus, maybe I'll start with you, which is, we hear about all of this innovation, we hear about all of these new technologies that could come through. Maybe hydrogen's a good example. What is it we need to see happen to get them from being innovation and R&D to being in the real world and being actually implemented across the whole of the country?
Well, I think there's a lot of talk about hydrogen, in all kinds of different applications of which it might appear, and probably realistically, if it has an important role, it will be in a smaller number of applications than it's currently being talked about. But I think the key thing really is visibility on cost reduction. So I think we need to see government R&D, as I said, and we also need to see a lot of entrepreneurial activity getting hydrogen costs down, the cost of electrolyzers, the cost of producing the hydrogen, shipping it securely, and so on. So that's the thing that we've got to see in the next few years. It doesn't need to happen overnight. We don't need to have this solved by 2021, but the effort, the entrepreneurial effort and the government effort needs to start kicking in the next few years.
Perfect. And Jim, in terms of your view of the future world of hydrogen, do you think some of the stuff that gets talked about, is it pie in the sky? Where do you see that hydrogen economy going to?
Sure. Well, about focus and things that we're demonstrating. I mean, just to play that into what you've just asked, Angus, I think this late stage demonstration, one of our colleagues asked a question about, is there real value in that late stage demonstration? And absolutely. I mean, the consultations we've had with industry leaders cross-sectoral is that de-risking of the higher technology readiness level part of getting technology out of the labs, out of proof of concept into a demonstration at scale is key. And look at the Orkney hydrogen demonstrator, Nigel Holmes and the team at the Scottish Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association, doing their work along with industry and local government there, electrolysing water driven by green energy, taking hydrogen to the main island, using it to power cars. As it happened, or vans. Susan used a very important word there, confidence. So this is about de-risking, making confident commitments. And for me, hydrogen's, a very significant activity. Without me getting into detail, Keith, there are one or two major aviation firms who are taking a battering just now because of COVID, are now looking at the next generation. And COVID, as we'll look back in the next few years, hopefully, few years, we'll see COVID as an accelerator for digital transformation. We'll see it as an accelerator for decarbonising, and we'll see it as a real driver for innovation. And you'll see the aviation industry moving towards, prospectively, not just the synthetic fuels, but hydrogen as a fuel as we go more electric. So it's a reality, but we need to de-risk that acceleration from concept to demonstration at scale.
Perfect. We're just about out of time. Very, very briefly, Tracy, if you look at the great promise of jobs, of training opportunities, of the green recovery, right, what's the reality of retraining thousands of people, the reality of creating opportunities for thousands of youngsters leaving school and university, and can that happen in time, or are we looking at a horrible wave of unemployment and redundancy?
Look, there's no doubt that particularly our young workforce, or people who've just possibly entered the workforce in the last 2 or 3 years, are particularly vulnerable at the moment. However, I actually take a lot of confidence out of what has actually been demonstrated by thousands of workers across Scotland and the UK in the last 6 months. The things that employers have asked their staff to do, we would never have imagined. You know, millions of workers learning how to use new technology at home overnight. Call centres being moved out of enormous buildings into homes, and people learning how to do these Zoom calls. I hear a lot, and I sit on the Skills Development Scotland board, about we must develop more meta skills in our young people. We must develop a more innovative culture. Well, I think Scotland's proven that we actually do have a lot of those core skills. So what we now need to do is actually give opportunities to people that are maybe coming out of a sector that maybe doesn't have as a rosy a future. So we know retail is going to be really challenging, where tourism, for example, is going through a really tough time. But I'm very confident that in 2 or 3 years, tourism will come back. But it's about working with the institutions that Scotland's blessed to have. We've got the universities, we've got the college sector, we've got things like Skills Development Scotland and Scottish Enterprise. Many countries don't have those agencies to bring that together. But I think business has been quite reluctant in the past to say, what do we actually need in the next 5 or 10 years? They seem to find that really hard. And I think that's where people, an organisation like GYM and the University of Strathclyde, can really help work with business to identify what are those skills and how do we get more flexible learning in there, which most of the universities have gone to. So I think actually COVID will be this pivot point to blended learning, to more flexible working, and we've just got to bring all the parts together.
Perfect. Right. Thank you. Look, unfortunately, honestly, there's so many more questions, and we could carry on this debate for another hour at the very, very least. Can I just say a massive thank you to Tracy, to Angus, to Jim, to Susan. You were all brilliant, fantastic as always, really, really good. And I'm sure the audience have loved hearing it. Judith, a huge thank you to you and to all of the team at All Energy. It really is. I still think absolutely with confidence, it's the best energy conference anywhere in the UK every year. Thank you so much for managing to put it on again this year. To everybody watching, I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you keep tuning in to all of the other sessions at All Energy and have a fantastic day. Cheers. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.